So for this little mini demo, I'm going to show an example of how to create a quick and dirty little way of packaging up an animation inside what's referred to as a unit. And we'll be able to then trigger these animations dynamically, either through script or using an emitter. Let's go ahead and see how that would work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to undock the hierarchy panel. I'm going to just right click in here or hit the plus button, doesn't matter, it's the same thing. And I'm going to do new unit and timeline. So let me just explain a little bit of what a unit is, and then from there we can kind of understand how this is going to work. So a unit is just like a node, like any other type of node, except it contains its own library inside it. And so the idea of a unit is you can think of a unit as bundling everything we would want to render something. So let's say you have a tree, and a tree is made up of like a mesh, and it's made up of a texture for leaves, and maybe it has sounds of a wind blowing through the tree. You could package that all up into a unit, and you could store it all inside a library, inside the unit, all inside the unit's library. And this way, you can then make instance copies, shared copies of that unit, and they would all share the same library, but you would each one would have its own state. It's just a nice way of kind of bundling all the resources that you might use for a particular object. You can think of a unit as comprised of entities. So a unit is comprised of entities. You can think of these as your atomic units, your entities, and the unit itself is like your molecule. It's like your thing that's comprised of a bunch of entities. So in this case, I've comprised this unit of just, let's say, a very simple box in this case. And I'm going to remove, and the other thing that this particular unit has, when I clicked on add a new unit and timeline, so I'm going to go back here when I clicked, is that this unit also has its own little timeline inside it. So we can now create animations that are all relative to this unit. And now each time we create a copy of that unit, they can start playing that little animation, basically. So that's the big idea. That's the idea of what we're going to show today. Okay, so I created this unit timeline. Inside the unit, I just drew this box. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove the rigid body of the box, because we're going to be animating it, so I'm just going to remove that. And I can also remove this trigger activating. We won't be doing that right now. And then what I'm going to do is on its transform for this box entity, I'm going to create a new key track. And whenever you create new key track, it actually creates it on whatever the active timeline is here. So you can actually create more timelines than just one. So I can create another timeline in here, double click on it, it goes here. Now if I click on an object's property and say create a new key track, it'll actually go into this timeline. So just remember that new key track will always add its key track in whatever the current editing timeline is. And that's a really cool way to bundle animations, right? I might create a separate timeline that I want to put a bunch of animations in, and this kind of lets us control for that. So I'm going to delete that timeline I just created, back into the units timeline where we created this transform key track. Now I'm just going to animate this in some way. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to say, okay, I want to animate from that location to, in 2 seconds, I'm going to animate that to, for some odd reason, I cannot click on the timeline here. Oh boy, this has not been the day of random issues here. Our key track seems to be disabled. Timeline. Can't seem to fast forward time here. Well, normally you click and drag in this root area here, but for some odd reason, today is the day that Simmetri decides it wants to be flaky. I'm going to go ahead and restart Simmetri. This note, your result will vary from this. All right, I'm just going to be in the space here. I'm going to create a new unit and timeline. Let's just verify I can drag. What is up with that? All right, I have to take a look at that. Okay, create a new unit. With the timeline, I created this object inside the unit. I'm going to click on this box. I'm going to create a new on the timeline. I'm going to remove this box's rigid body, trigger activating as well. I'm going to create a new key track, got to add it to this unit. Oh boy. Now, okay, so now I can hit record a keyframe. I'm going to fast forward time to 3 seconds. I'm just going to move this kind of up here. I'm going to record another keyframe. So now the box in this unit timeline is going to do this. It's going to warp from here to here. I'm then going to right click inside here to define an interpolation for that. I'm going to do like elastic ease in. So now as it eases in, as it goes out of this keyframe, and as it approaches, it eases into this keyframe. It does this kind of elastic effect. It does that kind of boinky kind of effect. Maybe I'll do that a little faster in 1 second. Every 1 second it does that. Okay, so now we have this unit that every time we hit play does that little animation. And so we have this little packaged animation that we can kind of recreate now. And so one of the fun ways to do this is just to use an emitter, a node emitter for that matter. So I click on emitter, node emitter, I click the node emitter in the space, and then for this node emitter, I'm going to, if I view its properties, as you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that it has this sample property. That's the object it samples to emit. I'm going to pick this unit that we just created. So now, every single time this emits an object, it will emit this unit, and it will do that little animation every time. So this is kind of a fun way to package animations and then replay them back. So I'm going to crank up the speed at which it emits. So now it does it much faster. And if you do it really fast, you get this kind of weird, kind of interesting effect. Now, the emitter only allows a certain number of objects that you can control for through here at max simultaneous. So I'm going to set this to like 64. Now I'll have a lot more kind of going in this space here. So it's kind of a neat way of kind of packaging these animations. Now, another thing you might want to be able to do is, I want to trigger this this animation to happen at a particular point in time, or maybe I want to push a button in the space or activate something. Let's create a trigger, for instance. So let's say we have this trigger, and when something rolls through this trigger, I want it to play this animation. So how would we do that? What we're going to do is, if we click on this unit here, I'm going to double click on it to edit its contents, and you'll see that I'm in its timeline. You'll notice that the timeline by default is true, so when I hit play, it starts playing right away. I'm going to set that to false by default. So now when I hit play back into the root space here, nothing happens. We just need to kind of go in, hunt for that timeline, and then we can then activate it. So how do we do that? So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go to the trigger, and I'm going to say, on this trigger, I'm going to bring in this object here, this unit. And I'm going to say unit, I believe, if I remember correctly, the unit has a get timeline. I always forget which functions are exposed. Get timeline, let me verify this. If not, we do this another way. The space, the bundle, nope, it does not have a function to get timeline. I probably have to add that because it makes things much easier. There's lots of different ways we can get the timeline. We could just drag and drop it directly into here. I'll show you another way to get the timeline. We're going to say unit, get the instance library. Instance library. Find object by name, timeline. This is just going into its timeline, into its library. In this case, double click on the unit. This is its library here. It's going into its instance library. So a library, every object actually has two libraries. It's a little confusing, but you can imagine one library stores like textures and stuff like that. That would be shared amongst shared instances. So if I make shared copies of this unit, they would all kind of point to the same library. That's referred to as the shared library. You get access to it like that. But then every object also has an instance library, which contains things like objects that I create locally inside this unit, like boxes and stuff like that. They're all unique to each instance. As I make copies, they each have their own local instances, and you access that through instance library. And the timeline in this case lives in that instance library. A little confusing, but this is one way to get the timeline that's inside that unit. And we're just going to set its active state to true. Okay, so when something now goes through this trigger, it will activate our animation here for this thing here. So I'm just going to roll a sphere through it. And there we go. That activates that timeline. So it's a neat way to package timeline that way. Another way we could do it is we could use the timeline of the space. I could create a script timeline here. There's actually a couple ways we do it, but we'll just use a script track. And after 3 seconds, double click on this, we can just repeat what we just did in here. I'm just going to copy and paste this. After 3 seconds, call play on that timeline. And there we go. It's another way to do that. So we can trigger it based on triggers, but maybe when we push a button it does that. We can emit these things as we saw before. I'm just going to drag and drop that into the unit into here. To kind of get that kind of cool effect, that kind of multiplicity effect. We can do it based on time, or we can do it based on a trigger. It's already been triggered here, so it's not doing it. So that's the idea of a unit and timeline. Right click, new unit and timeline, and then you just create animations inside there, and then you can activate them at will. That wraps up this little animation, this little tutorial.